Welcome back to World War II TV. Did you miss me? 11 days without a show? Well, of course, I was busy with all the commemorations here in Normandy, so there's been lots of meeting up with people. So some of my previous guests I met up with, had drinks with, met lots of veterans, went round to numerous places, but back now in the saddle for more World War II TV. So welcome back. This is the first of our Railways Week. In this first show of the series, Gary Bonsall will talk about the incredible logistics behind Bomber Command, involving an astonishing number of engines and wagons. So if you're new to the channel, if you found us over the last 10 days, maybe you've come in from Time Ghost and the D-Day specials I was part of, welcome on board. Don't forget, all the information you need is in the description below on YouTube. And after the show is finished and aired, if you rewatch it, you can do that buy me a coffee thing where you press a button and give a donation, or you can consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. But I'm going to bring Gary in now. So good evening, Gary. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm great, Paul. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm delighted to be here.
So thank you. So railways, first question for you, Gary, is which came first in your interest, the railways aspect or the military aspect or the social history aspect?
Well, for me, in terms of my general approach to this, it's both. Military history and railways have both interested me since childhood. And so when I was doing my degree in railway studies, really railway history, I decided that I'd try and make the two things fit together for my dissertation. But as you know from our conversation earlier, I'm more interested in the social side of railways than the geeky, techie, pounds per square inch in a boiler thing.
And apparently there are some real geeks when it comes to railways, as there are tanks, as there are aircraft. So folks, I'm going to bring up Gary's PowerPoint in a minute. Please feel free to fire away with questions as we go along. And Dr. Philip Blood is in the audience, who's tomorrow's guest. He may be able to field some train questions as well. And I'm glad we finally got here after 3 years, Gary, because it's amazing how many times trains have come up in passing. And we've said, we'll go back at some point and look at that. They've come up in dealings with Operation Barbarossa. They've come up in just movement of POWs and resistors through France, things like that. But it's fine now. Finally, we're looking at trains. And this is a really interesting aspect. So Bomber Command. So here's your PowerPoint. Nudge me when you need me to move on slides, and I'll hand over to you, Gary, to look about the transporting ammunition for Bomber Command in World War II.
Thanks. That's brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I think, first of all, I should explain why the title's there, the fourth arm, because, of course, we all know Navy, Army, Air Force in that order, senior service first, of course. Towards the end of the war, it was very clear that railways had played such an enormous part in the logistical effort to help win the war, that they'd actually been like a fourth service. And they were described as the fourth arm in Parliament in 1945. And it's interesting, this fourth arm thing, because, of course, the early railways were organised very much on military lines. So the guys who joined the railways, they signed up for really strict discipline, long working hours, the uniform. It was like a military service. And the guys are in it. There was a real esprit de corps across the railway companies. And so I think that fourth arm thing is important. But it's also important at this stage. I've used the word, you notice I've got a photo of a railway engine there. That's a London and North Eastern Railway, I think the class B17, which I took on a preserved railway in Norfolk recently. So it's my own photo. Of course, the engines in the war would look nothing like that. They'd have been run down, dirty, decrepit things, used within an inch of their life. It's difficult. But, you know, my dissertation was about railways originally, but it expanded, it had to expand into road transport as well, because every single piece of ammunition that was moved at some time was moved by road as well as rail. So my transporting bit, although I focus on the railways, it's very much a bimodal thing.
Okay.
So if we can move on, that's brilliant. And this is, I've used that word inspiration because I was actually inspired by a leaflet I found. And this leaflet was produced, I think, in the mid-50s, where it described there being a huge number of trains needed to support a 1,000-bomber raid. Now, people in the audience will probably know better than I do, but as far as I'm aware, only 3 raids were ever designated as 1,000-bomber raids. There were lots of raids that had that many bombers in them later on, but only 3 raids in 42 were described as being 1,000-bomber raids. I'm happy to be corrected on that. But notice there how much stuff, and logistical term, technical logistical term, how much stuff had to be moved to support a 1,000-bomber raid. So 650 tank cars of aviation spirit and 362 probably 10-ton wagons of bombs and ammunition. Initially, I was going to consider both the fuel side and the munitions side, but it became clear very early on that actually I didn't have enough space in 15,000 words to cover both. So I focused very much on the bomb side of thing, the exciting thing. And logistics, we'll talk in a slide or two about logistics and the definitions of logistics and what it means. But how did they do it? And at that time there were 4 main railway companies. And forgive me, audience, if I'm telling you things that you already know. But there were 4 main railway companies: the Southern Railway, mostly commuter railway, a passenger railway in the south of England. The Great Western Railway speaks for itself, looking after the west, but right up the west coast as well. So heavily involved in moving stuff from Liverpool and the western ports as well. So heavily involved in particular moving the Americans into UK. But the London and North Eastern Railway and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway in particular, these were the railways that served bomber country. And bomber country really was the whole of East Anglia, up from Essex through Suffolk, through Norfolk, into Lincolnshire, into East Yorkshire. And they're the 2 companies that I focused on in terms of my research and what I thought about. It's important to recognise that in my final bullet about how important steam railways were. Terrain, he wrote a book called The Right of the Line, which is one of the definitive histories of the RAF in World War II. And Terrain said in a book which is purely about the Air Force, but he describes steam being the prime motive force. Not just World War I, when you'd think, yeah, of course it was steam, but World War II too. And as I've said there, the country was really suffering from enormous shortages. The fuel was really short, rubber was even shorter. And I put that line there about poor quality coal because actually they had to use some pretty grubby stuff at times to keep their engines running. And I should say at this point that going back to the first point about the 650 tank cars of fuel needed, those tank cars were replaced later in the war by a thing called the government pipeline and storage system. So rather than moving the fuel by rail, there was an enormous network, a pipeline network built around the country to actually obviate the need to move them. Obviously much safer from enemy attack and far better.
And just to jump in, Gary, it's amazing how much I've learned on this during these shows is that you're going to be talking about the creation of and the implementation of this system, but this is happening at the same time as all the other systems that are being created in the UK. We had the show about the coastal convoys going up and down the east coast of shipping. With the Observer Corps are setting up their stuff. The Home Guard and LDRDV are building all their bunkers and pillboxes. There's so many programs happening at exactly the same time in a country that, as you said, there is short of everything. Although we're looking at the railways today, these events are not happening in isolation. It's another reminder of just how much effort the UK and indeed the other countries of the Dominion had to go through to get all these things off and running. It's amazing. But
it is.
Back to you.
And I think when you mention the Home Guard, of course, the railway companies had loads of Home Guard battalions. They'd got their own fire watchers, they've got their own Home Guard, they've got their own, they had to duplicate their networks, their control systems, so they could carry on through the bombing. The effort was incredible. And particularly in the 2 winters, 1940-41, 41-42, which were some of the harshest winters ever, they kept going. And the sheer logistical effort, not just of providing bombs, but of the railmen and rail women getting to work, to do things. And I think without that esprit de corps, without the thing that the point we're all in it together, the country's fighting for survival, then, this wouldn't have happened. And it just fascinates me. I'm sorry, I sound like a geek now, don't I? But
it's fine. We're geeking out on a subject that's interesting. So we'll move on. So brilliant stuff.
So far. So this is a really boring photo. This is a boring photo of some sheeted 10-ton wagons. Now, it's very, very difficult, or was very difficult for me to find any relevant images of ammunition transport, particularly for the RAF in World War II. I struggled really hard. And this is actually a photo taken at Corsham in Wiltshire, which was a naval armament depot. And this is a train of naval munitions entering the depot at Corsham. It's just illustrative of what things look like. So when I talk about sheeted 10-ton wagons, this is what they look like. They're pretty boring things, aren't they, when you look at? But when you think
I'm sure there's some people watching who would disagree with you.
Yeah,
some of
yeah.
the railway is going, that's probably a beautiful photo.
Yeah,
to them.
it probably is.
Yeah.
But, 630, so how many are there? What can we see? 4? So another 358 is all you need to provide your 1,000 bomber raid with bombs. That's all you need. So that's a photo of logistics in action. I mean, we can't see it moving because I really struggled to find any moving images at all of ammunition transport for the RAF. I found some Army stuff, Navy stuff, but not RAF stuff. And that leads me into my next slide, please, Paul, which is really, and I've called it the logistics problem. And I think it's important to focus on that very first point, first of all, a definition. What is it? Now, logistics, really, we all use the term now, don't we? We see lorries on the road, Bonsall logistics. What does it mean? What does it actually mean? Well, for my purposes, I adopt a very simple definition from Van Greffeld. But notice that 1977. And really, I found that a very simple definition. So it's the real thing here, from my perspective, it's the keeping them supplied bit. But of course, the RAF had to be moved. All the people had to be moved around the country, as well as the ammunition and the fuel. There's all the food and everything else that goes with keeping an airfield of several thousand people supplied. And I focused purely on Bomber Command. If I'd got sucked into looking at the 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force in the UK, which interests me as well very much, but I'd really struggled to have enough granularity, quite frankly. I'm not going to read out these other things, but you can see from the middle three that they're all saying that logistics is boring. It's not sexy. It's boring. It's technical. Who cares about it? Well, who cares about it is the end user and all the people providing that end user. And I really struggled to find any images of logistics other than on airfields. There's lots of writing about ground crews and how important they were, in bombing up the aircraft and fueling the aircraft, but very, very little about how the stuff got there and who was involved in that particular bit. And that penultimate comment there by O'Brien from March this year, of course, was referring to a current conflict, not to World War II. He's talking about now. He's talking about Ukraine. And that's only part of his definition, because I think he also says in that very same article about, it's boring, technical and all this, but it's compared to the testosterone-fueled something, I forget the word, the testosterone-fueled action of heavy artillery. So people get excited by tanks and guns and aircraft. They don't get excited by logistics, except in that quote at the bottom, which is attributed to General Omar Bradley, but I was unable to source its provenance. But I quite like that. You mentioned military history to me at the beginning. Well, I'm an amateur in that field as well. But when you get into logistics properly, that's what the professionals talk about. Because in military campaigns, without adequate logistics, then you're nowhere.
Well, it's like anything else, isn't it? The good logistics, if you're studying a campaign, good logistics, you don't notice, but you notice bad logistics. It's like special effects in films. Yeah. If you notice them, it's because they're bad. And so the logistics tend to come into writing about battles when it's not working. So if a general hasn't got the fuel he needs, or he hasn't got the ammunition, then it comes up. But if everything's working seamlessly, it tends not to come up, which is then therefore not really giving the credit to the efficiency of it running is that it doesn't quite get the conversations it should do, but it does on this channel. So
exactly right, exactly right. And I think it's important to say as well, you know, that the second comment from Phillips, that's about World War One. That's about World War One, but it still applies. It applies today. It applied to World War One, World War Two, and it still applies today. So I think that's really interesting. Can we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. So I set about this thing, and I think it's important to recognise, as I say there has been virtually no academic study of logistics in World War II, and very little study of logistics anywhere else come to that. And the people who actually write about railways get excited about, as I've called them, the big headline events. There's loads of literature about Dunkirk. There's lots about the evacuation from London and the southeast. I mean, that was an amazing logistical feat too, wasn't it? Moving all those children and you know, in some cases their parents to, you know, all over the country and on a, you know, being received by volunteers and managed. It's just remarkable. Well worth talking about. And there's oodles of stuff about Overlord. Now, of course, Overlord is incredibly important, but the stuff about logistics just doesn't feature. And as I've said there's no real, you know, when you're doing an academic dissertation, you're supposed to do a historiography, i.e. a history of the history, what's been written about it, how has thinking developed over time. And I'll talk about thinking developing over time when I come to my final bullet on this page about the moral controversy. But there's nothing. I say nothing, but you know, if people are watching this want to see my dissertation, I'm very happy to be contacted and people can have a copy of it. Or if they just want to see my bibliography, I'm very happy to provide that as well, because you know I want the word to be out there. So I approached, you know, quite a lot of different organisations. So NRM, National Railway Museum in York, the RF Museum at Hendon, British Library, and the National Archives. TNA is the National Archives. National Railway Museum, it's not a subject they've really thought about. There was very little there. They tried to be helpful, but nothing. The RF Museum had a lot more stuff for me. They were very helpful. British Library just involved me looking through loads of books. And I must say at this point that the library at York, where I studied, were absolutely fantastic. As an academic library, I find them hard to fault, quite frankly. But you can see that I focused on things in a number of series at the National Archives. I won't bore you with them. But what I found disappointing was I couldn't find any archives from the London North Eastern Railway at all. Couldn't find anything. I could find their staff magazine, and I gleaned little bits from that. But the London Midland Scottish Railway have produced a wonderful series of books about their war effort. There's one for each year of the war, quite thick things like this in quite small type. They were useful, but very little about the bomber campaign, very little. The thing that you do see is stuff about the railway's involvement in building the airfields, i.e. transporting the rubble from Bond, London for the hardcore for airfields in East Anglia. You see quite a bit of that kind of stuff, but very little about the bomber campaign. So I was struggling a wee bit. And I have to say at the bottom, you know, the moral controversy. Now, I spoke about historiography. Immediately after the war, there's a guy I quoted in my dissertation. I've forgotten his name now, but he was talking about the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER, having the honour of leading the bombing campaign by providing the bombs. Now, these days, we take a slightly different view of that because our view of the history has moved on. And it's important to say that Churchill himself described the bomber campaign as terror bombing. I mean, Churchill himself did that. Now, you know, I don't want to get into the controversy bit at all, but it's important to recognise.
It's pertinent in terms of the fact of you not being able to find as much information. I mean, you know, we could go into the whole Dr. Beeching type of thing in the 50s and 60s, but I can completely imagine the railways wanting to disassociate themselves from the bomber effort and focusing on other, I don't know, more popular aspects with the public, and getting evacuees back to London maybe would be a more positive story to tell. But so, yeah, as you said, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole. I said it early there, folks. You can have a drink, but we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about the moral issue. But it is interesting that it seems to have had, or it could have had, an effect on the lack of people researching this back in that kind of golden era of writing about World War II. Interesting.
I think that's absolutely right, Paul. Absolutely right. So against that background, let's move on to some detailed stuff. So as it says there, before the war, the RAF was really woefully provided with ammunition storage facilities. I think they got 2 little tiny depots scattered around the country, which were neither use nor ornament, and they held very little stock indeed. I mean, absolutely nothing compared to what was coming. I don't think anybody could possibly imagine what was going to happen. Then don't forget, folks, please, that when I talk figures later on, I'm talking purely about the RAF. I suspect the US Army Air Force had just as much munitions, much ammunition moved around for them as the RAF did. So that's important to recognise as well. So the RAF started to build in 1936, 37, 38 time, some major underground depots. And they wanted them underground for obvious reasons, to be away from German bombers. And they built them kind of towards the west of the country. So and they were called reserve ammunition depots. That's what the RAD bit is there. So there was Fold, and I've put a line there about the Scropton tramway, and Fold was actually linked to the main railway line by a little narrow gauge railway, and we'll see some pictures of that shortly. Fold was in Staffordshire. Harper Hill, the next one, was in Derbyshire, and Chilmark was in Wiltshire. So that's kind of the furthest west one. But don't forget, I showed you that naval depot earlier on, which is even further west. So these major depots were supplied by rail from munitions factories. But as I say there, I didn't investigate that part of the process. I've done little bits of looking at it since, but I'm struggling to find stuff. I really am. Then what they developed were a series of forward depots, and they kept changing their names. So when they began, they were air ammunition parks. That's the AAP bit. Then they were forward ammunition depots as opposed to reserve ammunition depots. And then the kind of current nomenclature the RF still uses was MU, maintenance unit. So, if I say, I'll probably say FAD or MU as we go along, but I might mean AAP. But they kept changing the names, and trying to keep up with it is really difficult. But notice that 7 of these depots, I think they got 11 at the end of the war, 7 were in Bomber Command in Eastern England. As it says there, it was the entire east of the country was airfields. You couldn't move for airfields. And most of them had a station nearby. I've not found any evidence of a Bomber Command airfield with a railway line leading straight to it. If anybody has, I'd be delighted to hear it, but I didn't find any. I've seen a photograph of an airfield. I think it's a Coastal Command airfield in Scotland with a railway line, but nothing else. So please, guys, if anyone's seen anything, I'd love to know. That little bit of research, Nunn is a geographer, and I found this in his PhD about Norfolk. And it was just kind of passing thing that I found. So almost half the airfields in Norfolk, and there are, I think, from memory, about 50 airfields in Norfolk, were around 3 miles from a railway station. So, the railways ran very close to the airfields, but not to them. So, which is where the road transport bit comes in as well. But notice as well that, the processes developed as they went along. So in 1943, they began actually delivering straight to the forward depots rather than the reserve depots. Reserve depots are still important. They were still full of stuff or being used, but they reduced the number of steps in bomb handling. So they improved their logistical processes from 9 to 5. So rather than being handled 9 times before they went to store, they were handled 5 times. And I think that's a really interesting thing to know. They developed their processes, as did the railways, and we'll come on to that in a little while. And then, I make the point again at the bottom about stuff being moved by road. So each forward ammunition depot had 10 or 15 airfields it supplied. I've found airfields as far as 35 miles away from a railhead or from a depot. And so in the 10 or 15 airfields, some might be 3, 4, 5 miles away, but some could be over 30. So if you're in a convoy of vehicles doing 30 miles an hour overnight in blackout conditions with no lights, you can imagine the difficulty of that. It really was. And the vehicles that they use, it's interesting. There was a mixture of military vehicles, railway road vehicles, because the railways were big into road haulage. They had to be, because they were the parcel carrier and they delivered in those days, and civilian hauliers who were contracted in. So there was a mixture of things being used there. The military vehicles towards the end of the war were certainly driven by female drivers. There were lots of women drivers driving these ammunition lorries towards the end. And that's a really interesting piece of history to look into further. And I think one of the important things for me, Paul and everybody, is actually I turned over so many rocks in this that, they've exposed loads of things that could well be investigated further. And I would love to.
I mean, I'm just thinking about this fact, Gary, of the airfields. They're all about 3 miles away from a railway station, although we did have, Nick has said that Brize Norton in Oxfordshire has a railway line and station right next to it. So there's one.
That's helpful, Nick. Thank you.
I wonder whether when the airfields are being planned, the siting of the airfields is being planned, anybody is even thinking about how they're going to get the bombs there, or whether they're thinking about the amount of bombs that they're going to need. Because as you said there, the cranking up of the effort was amazing, because you've got to go back to 38, 39. I guess a lot of people would have never imagined that we'd have been able to field a few years later hundreds of Halifaxes and Lancasters, because we didn't have. So I wonder whether any consideration was made into that, because if they had got half of those airfields half a mile from a railway line, or because it could extend the railway line by a few hundred yards, I wonder how much that would have improved the efficiency. But I wonder whether or not it was even a consideration, because as we said at the beginning of the show, so many things are being set up in 1939, 40, 41. You can't have them all connected. You can't, otherwise they'd have never got out of meetings. If everybody had to have their say, we'd still be going around trying to have meetings. It's fascinating though.
I think we would. I think going back to the point made about Brize Norton. Sorry, who was it made that?
Nick Blakehow.
Thank you, Nick, for making that point. That's really interesting. I don't know if Brize Norton was ever a bomber command station. I don't know. Oxfordshire's a little bit far west for it, but I'm glad to hear that there is an airfield with a railway station.
And Willie Robertson is saying, I don't know how you pronounce that.
Lucas. So Lucas, thank you, Willie. That may well be the one I saw the photo of.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Willie.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So where was I in terms of this movement thing? So yeah, lots of things I want to investigate, and we could look at further. We can look at the next slide, please, Paul. So these are 2 of the only official photos I could find. These are from the Imperial War Museum, and these are things being moved on the Scropton tramway. So these are RAF Fold. And of course, I meant to mention, lots of you will have heard the name Fold, because Fold, of course, was the scene of one of the worst explosions ever in the country. And the crater at Fold is still a sight to behold. But these things, you can see little diesel locomotives. They're quite small on my screen, but on the photo on the left, as you look at it, where you can see the engine in the foreground, you've got there, on the right-hand side of it, as you look, a guy in RAF uniform walking along next to this train, which I believe is carrying 250-pound bombs standing up on their tails. But on the far side, there are 3 civilian guys. And in the background, there are civilians. And these depots were definitely a mixture of military and civilian personnel. Another area I'd like to look at, I know that there was an armament depot up near Warrington. Someone will tell me what it's called, I'm sure. But there, I found evidence of there being 60 women working on site, didn't know, I couldn't find out what they did. And I'd love to know whether they were actually involved in any other logistics rather than maybe packing parachutes or attaching tail fins and things, which is what they tended to do. And the photo on the right shows, I think, 500-pound bombs. And again, I'm not technically competent enough to know whether they are or not. But the ones in the first photo on the left are standing up on the tails. The ones in the photo on the right are lying down in different sorts of wagons. So there were clearly different ways of transporting these things and moving them around the piece. And if you go to next slide, please, Paul. Now, this is, some of you will recognise an Avro Lincoln in the background there. So you'll know this isn't a wartime photo. This is one that was taken shortly post-war. But this is an Austin K3 bomb flat. And you can see on there a number of, I think, 250-pound bombs with transit rings on them. And they've got these rings on them so you can roll them along. And what they did at many of the depots and at the railway stations, they built a loading platform which was just the same height as the bed of a K3 or a K2 lorry, any flatbed lorry, and you just roll the stuff onto it. If you were, and the vast majority of the ammunition, of the munitions that were dropped, were actually 250 and 500-pound bombs. They're the main things that they dropped. And these transit rings were to help roll the things along, but they were removed before the bombs were dropped. I don't know what these two guys are up to on there, but I think, I really struggled to find. I did find one fantastic photo, but it was on I think on a Reuters site, and I just couldn't use it, copyright, and the cost of it was stupid. Yeah. But it was a civilian articulated lorry carrying a 10,000-pound bomb. And that was just fantastic.
Well, hopefully someone watching this will give you some leads there, because there's a whole plethora of people out there with access to archives and museums across the world. So you don't know what might flood in following your appearance here. But yeah, even the few images we've got are telling a very good story. So it's all fantastic.
That's great. Thank you. Let's move on now to railways themselves, Paul, if we can. So, the railways themselves. Let's start with my bottom bullet first. I've written the word British Railways there. During the war, as far as I can tell, is the first time they began talking about British Railways. Prior to that, it was the four companies that covered different parts of the country who were in competition. I mean, the LNER and the LMS both went up to Scotland, LNER to Edinburgh, LMS to Scotland, both vying to be the fastest and the best, the most streamlined and all this kind of stuff. And they were competing. The Great Western Railway ran nearly all the way up the west coast to Liverpool, for goodness sake, and maybe even beyond. So, it was competition. And the companies were proud of themselves. They got their own liveries, their own uniforms, their own staff. But they began to talk about British Railways. And that takes us back, I think, to that joint effort thing, people working together. The four companies are cooperating to work together. And so on the 31st of August in 1939, so, just before the war broke out, five days before the war broke out, the Railway Executive Committee was formed. And the Railway Executive Committee mirrored the situation in World War I, when a committee of railmen, professional railmen, was set up to manage and run the railways for the duration. And that's what they did. And as it says there, they told the railways that they had to obey the instructions of military movement officers. And the bit I'm bothered about, the Air Force thing, had, 10 what they call movements officers. I couldn't find out what rank they were. Couldn't find it. I've been all through the National Archives trying to find out what rank these guys are. They must be quite senior. My guess would probably be Air Vice Marshal or maybe Air Commodore. That would be my guess. But they had loads of junior officers working for them. I found I forgot to mention the Air Force's operational record books as well. They were on one of my slides. You look in the ORBs, I found a few references to junior movement officers visiting armament depots. These are guys at flight lieutenant level, but I was unable to find out about the seniority of these guys. But it's clear they were very senior, because the guys they were liaising with in the railways were incredibly senior guys. So that's, and it's going back to my, that point I made, or we made earlier on about cooperative working, which you mentioned, Paul, I think, they really did try to get this combined service spirit. I mean, that's the policy statement in 42. And I wondered whether they made that point in 42, because that's when the Americans were joining the war mostly.
Mm.
They were really cooperating really well. And I'd love to investigate as well, how the US military fitted into all this as well. But I think that bit about, British Railways first becoming prominent is really quite important.
Mm.
We can move on to the next one, please, Paul, if that's all right. So this one, it's a bit more about lower level activity, okay? And notice that, this inquiry committee in April 41 said there was no insuperable difficulty adopting standard practice across the 4 railway companies. Now, they did quite a bit about that, but of course, and again, Paul, going back to your point, very little money. They wanted to have far better communication facilities. They wanted more telephone lines. They wanted, as it says in the bottom slide, conference calls. No money, no staff. Very difficult to do it. So it took them longer to bring that in than it should have done. But but don't forget as well, loads of technical staff have gone off to the railways. I'll talk later on about, I think 100,000 men left the railways, replaced by 60,000 women. Now some would say that's about right, wouldn't they? 60,000 women could easily do the work of 100,000 men.
Let's say something positive like that. Otherwise, people will be screaming at us. No, but you're right, and I'm thinking also, Gary, that with the railways, of course, everyone has to work together by necessity because of the rail network. I mean, everybody's wanting to use the rail network. It's being used for everything. It's transporting civilians and military personnel and freight and everything else there. So it's not like that. I mean, you could get to a certain point where in North Africa, the Navy and the Air Force wouldn't necessarily have to cross paths so much because they're operating in different spaces. I mean, obviously they did have to work together, but in this environment with the railways, they absolutely have to work together because there's only a finite amount of track. There's only a finite amount of stations and points. So they just have to make sure it's working, and it has to be working at maximum efficiency to get the best out of this limited network. Because as you said, with money, it's not like they can be building hundreds of miles of new railways in World War II. There isn't the time, the effort, the steel. I mean, all they've got to do is work with what they've got, I guess.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, I don't want to contradict you, but they.
No, you can, please.
they did. It's not my specialist subject, but they did do quite a bit of rail work, building new lines, building new. They link up 2 lines by a better route. And
so doubling up tracks and linking up. Yeah,
absolutely. And they built a lot more sidings because they had to store all the stuff they were moving around.
Okay, makes sense.
But again, I can't give you chapter and verse on that. The thing about these daily conference calls and situation reports, I think, is brilliant because the LMS it produced its twice daily situation reports, I believe, at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and it began collating at that time, and it produced its reports 2 hours later, every single day, and that is just astonishing. So that would go to the Railway Executive Committee, who've got the view over the entire piece, and the Minister of Transport. But the Minister of Transport actually was very much sidelined by these professional railmen. But I mean, there had to be, ministerial involvement, but the railway men ran the show, and they were allowed to do it, which I think is a very mature way of doing things, quite frankly. And given, and of course, going back to the very dawn of the railways, they were private sector. Everything was private sector. And, the government always, let's put the word interfered in inverted commas in the railways, things like safety. The government had to play a part in that because the railways just didn't react quickly enough to accidents. People getting killed left, right and centre. So the government had to be involved. But in the war, it stepped back a wee bit, letting them get on with things. And I just got a photo on the next slide just to show you a railway control room. This is the London North Eastern Railway control room. I think I think just pre-war, I wasn't able to narrow down anything very quickly. But, you know, these days, you think about the way we communicate, the different channels we can use. Look at what they've got there. Yeah, they've got a telephone. They've probably got loads of runners and maybe dispatch riders. But of course, the railways had wonderful communication links through the signalling system. And so they could communicate using bells and things along lines. But that just shows what things were like then and how different it is to today. But let's have a think about what it was like in a general sense now, please, Paul. So, as I said, 100,000 railmen went off and 60,000 females came on board. But, you know, they were working incredible hours in dreadful conditions. The infrastructure was just getting more and more dilapidated. There was less and less money to spend on it. And I like that line in the second bullet about new and strange transits over long distances. That's a comment from the London and North Eastern Railway staff magazine I mentioned, where a guy's writing about that. I've put the word Barnum there in inverted commas, in brackets, forgive me. Anybody know why I put the word Barnum on there when I'm talking about strange transits? Okay, there are at least two Barnums in this country. There's a major armament depot on the Norfolk-Suffolk border at Barnum, and there's a Barnum in Sussex, just near to Bognor, down there. Oh, yeah, near Bognor. The station master at Barnum in Bognor was really surprised one day to have a huge ammunition train arrive at the station because it had been routed to the wrong Barnum. And that's not an apocryphal story, that actually happened. I saw that in the operational record book, that they actually did that. And I think it was 3 days late arriving at its destination, because having worked there, got the route plan, got itself there, then had to come back all the way up to East Anglia. But there's one of the strange transits. And, you know, as I say, I saw that in a book by a fellow called Peter Pay about Norfolk branch lines. And I thought, let me have a look at it. And when I got to ARB, I found it. Conductors were drivers who were conducting drivers over unfamiliar routes. So, you know, you've got enginemen with normally no routes. They know the routes they worked on. Yeah, they know the fireman needs to stoke the fire at this time. You know, I need to slow down for this curve to this speed or whatever. But guys were working not just on their own railway, LNER and LMS, they were moving across the railway boundaries. And so they got to, you know, get used to new things. Some of them were getting on a wee bit. There's a line I saw, again in the LNER staff magazine, about these elderly workers. And it's guys, these people of 70 years and 10, whose work should long have been done, finding themselves far from home in the blackout and the blitz. You know, it's incredible. And of course, I've not mentioned at all the fact these trains were often getting attacked. You know, in the cab of the trains, they used to have blackout lines. So you'd be in there, you know, with a furnace, and you'd have to have blackout blinds so enemy aircraft couldn't see the fire from your locomotive. I mentioned the poor quality coal before. They were often using brown coal, which is pretty rubbish and difficult to burn. Things weren't being maintained. They didn't have the time to maintain them. You know, prior to this, engines would be loved. I mean, you know, they were. The guys who worked on them, the cleaners, the firemen, the drivers, they loved these things. But all engines became common user, which means that any locomotive could be used for any purpose. And I saw a little bit of information about a very underpowered locomotive being used to haul a major ammunition train, and it ran out of control. It ran through 2 stations out of control before it reached a gradient to stop it. That was up near Blackburn somewhere. So there was all kinds of stuff. And I love this thing at the bottom about how much traffic increased. It's insane. So you've got 50% more freight and nearly 70% more passengers in that 6-year period. But locomotive stock rose by 2.3%.
Yeah, I've been staring at that statistic since you put that slide up, and it's astonishing. I mean, it really is. I mean, when we said the photo of the operations, I was kind of thinking of this as being like a similar to the fighter operations rooms with except different as well, because the fighter operations response, it wasn't 24 hours a day necessarily. I mean, there were lulls where things weren't happening because of weather, because of various other issues, because of a raid happening. With this though, and it's the fact it is 24 hours a day, and it's 24 hours a day, 307 days a week, 365 days a year. And the pressure put on the rolling stock and the fewer number of personnel working on it, and the danger, the implicit dangers of doing all this in wartime, and that isn't even considering the fact they're actually transporting bombs. I mean, there's so many angles to this that are just absolutely fascinating.
Exactly right, and I like that point you make about they're actually transporting bombs. If you go on to the next slide, please, Paul, that takes us nicely to that one. Now, it's interesting the way things developed during the war. Notice early in the war, you could carry very little ammunition on a train, but look how much it grew, from 5 wagons to 60. And I showed you at the beginning those sheeted 10-ton trucks, and they really were the workhorses. They're the things that did it. So these things, the average length of a train was 35 cars, based on that a bullet further down about the LMS running its specials. It's about 35 per train. And I've seen further evidence of that. On some lines, they had, because these trains are very slow, they had to be passed by faster trains. The expresses, you can call them that in the war because there weren't very many, but they had to pass. And deciding the priority between an ammunition train and a train containing meat, say, and a train containing passengers, who's going to go first? How do you manage that?
Yeah.
But so these things had to be overtaken, and I saw an evidence of a line in Colchester, or in Essex, I should say, sorry, where you couldn't run a train of more than 40 wagons because it couldn't fit into a passing loop. So you were limited by the physical thing there as well. So these things were broken down. They were taken to a kind of marshalling yard, a holding point, and broken down into smaller trains. And Brafferton, which is up very far in North Yorkshire, every day it received an average of 9 wagons. So, but remember, it's all done by hand. Everything's been done by hand. Very limited moving equipment for these things. Lots of it was just grunt. And I mentioned a thing about them being block trains. A block train means it's all one cargo. So if you've got a block train of ammunition, you've not got to move, you've not got to shunt things around as usual. The thing about no brake pinning is interesting. Brake pinning means that lots of trains back in the day didn't have fitted brakes. There were no brakes on trains, except on the wagons themselves. So if they were heading down a hill, the guard and the fireman would have to leap out of the train and actually apply the brakes by hand. So every wagon had a little lever on it, and you could apply the brakes on the individual wheels. And to go down steep gradients, then they were allowed to pin, generally. But ammunition trains weren't allowed to have their brakes pinned in case it created sparks. Because there's always this fear of explosion. And of course, the biggest one probably most of us are aware of is the Soham explosion, which took place just prior to D-Day. It was American munitions being moved by an LNER train. From memory, it killed one of them survived. I think it killed the driver and the guard and the signalman, but one of the guys survived. But if the guys, extreme heroism, an ammunition train's on fire, and they did everything they could to move it away. They stayed on this thing to move it, flames belching out the back. It could have destroyed the town, frankly. But as it was, it destroyed the station, which was a wee way away from the town. And other little bits I learned, a wagon with a grease axle box. If anyone knows what a grease axle box is, I'd be delighted to find out. And with doors in them, weren't to be used. So just these little rules and regulations that came in. And the next slide,
We just got a couple of questions while it's on that one there.
Oh, of
So
course.
Ian Carr is asking, are these numbers still just the RAF?
Yes, they are.
Yep.
Yeah. As far as I know, they're just the RAF. Yes, they are, Ian.
And any of these specials get bombed by the Luftwaffe? Andreas is asking.
Andreas, I would imagine so, but I didn't look into that at all. Forgive me.
And there's bombed by the Luftwaffe, and there's deliberately bombed. I mean, I don't think the Germans had the intelligence information to know about what trains are running. But of course, there are raids coming over that would have just think if you're running this number of trains, then by sheer probability they're going to hit some of them. But I don't think they were thankfully able to know when we were transporting huge amounts of ordnance. If they'd known that, that would have been potentially very damaging.
And if you think about the case of Barnum, I don't think we knew sometimes either, which is quite useful. But I think that's a very good point you all make.
Brilliant.
You know, I've seen footage, or I've seen photos, particularly of Southern Railway trains that were strafed by German fighters. That used to be a tactic. You know, the ones in the south are really vulnerable. But I've not seen so much further north than that. If you go into the next one, yeah. So this is one of the few photos. This was given to me by a fellow called Martin Charlton, who's written a history of one of the armament depots. And, you know, he kind of gave me this. What's interesting about this one is that you'll see the way the bombs are laid out quite differently to the two narrow gauge shots I showed you earlier on. So some are transverse, some are longitudinal with those spars down the middle of the wagon. I don't know if those spars were fitted deliberately just to hold the two rows of bombs in the middle, or whether that was a conventional feature. That I don't know. You'll see this wagon's got a side door rather than an end door, and the bombs haven't got tails on them. They've got what are called transit plates. Yeah. And you'll see also there's a lug on top of these bombs as well, which means they could be craned off, you know, using that lug, but they can also, using that transit plate, be rolled. And looking at that photo, looking at the tailgate, the very tailgate of that lorry on the left of the picture, I would suggest that these are being rolled. So you kind of oil them up almost onto their end and just roll them like a barrel. That's how they move these things. But quite how you'd roll them across those wooden bars, I don't know. So maybe they've got
unless they're not fixed.
Oh, that's a good. Sorry, it's been a long day. Forgive me.
No. I mean, I'm just throwing it out. They just may be great big lumps of 4x6 or something that they put there, just and then they pick them up. And I don't know. I mean, it's to stop them rolling during transportation, then pick them. I mean, they could be fixed. I don't know.
But lots of. I mean, the great thing is, Paul, you see all these things. There are more questions than answers, aren't there? And that's why history is so
because you're starting something new. I mean, you know, when we have subjects on this channel, like, I don't know, the Dam Busters or Operation Market Garden or wherever it would be, hundreds of people have already trodden that path. And so there's data, there's been discussions. With something like this, it seems that you are pretty much stepping on virgin snow with this, which is fascinating. But it means at the moment you don't necessarily have all the answers, but that's the process.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's so much more that I'd like to know. But I hope I'm giving people, you know, something that interests them. If we can move on this is the penultimate slide, guys. So, you know, we're getting near to the end now, so you can begin to relax. I just threw some statistics together, and about the sheer effort. Now, Bomber Command flew its first mission on September the 4th, 1939, and it flew its last combat mission sometime in May 1945. Couldn't find the exact date. If I'd looked harder, I might have done, but it wasn't really germane to what I was doing. But look at that, nearly 400,000 sorties, almost 1 million tons of bombs. And it's that sheer daily figure that gets me, dropping 460 tons every 24 hours. It's just incredible. And all of these things were manhandled. That's what gets me. You know, when we read about the huge bombs like the Tall Boy, I think less than 20 of those were dropped in the war, I think. You know, it's the sheer grunt of the 250, 500-pound bombs that they were dropping. I did a little bit of calculating, but, you know, it's when Harris took over Bomber Command in 1942 that things really began to ramp up. When area bombing, carpet bombing, terror bombing, you know, the destruction of German cities began. And, you know, 95% of all the bombs they dropped were from 1942 onwards, and 3/4 of them between the end of 43 and May 45 alone. I picked on Barnum again because that was one of the biggest depots. And note there what it handled in 1938 as a normal little country station, and what it happened between 39 and 45. So 700,000 tons over that period, as opposed to 7,000.
These are insane figures, and thank you again for reminding us that a lot of this is done with what my dad would call brute force and ignorance, because that is it's back work, isn't it? I mean, that when we think about anything like the Women's Land Army, we see the photos of tractors and things like that, but of course the majority of the work was done by girls bending over digging up potatoes, and the same thing applies this. Of course there was tech, there was gear, there were cranes, there were hoists, but never enough. Anything like that is desperately needed by numerous places all around the UK, because as we said at the beginning, the Navy needs stuff, Coastal Command needs stuff.
Right.
So anything that's being made that would help in the unloading of anything is always going to be a priority for various people. So back-breaking work by these big people, that not only the railway staff but the RAF staff. And I think just considering the number of people involved in the RAF in just the transporting of bombs is something I'd never thought about before today's show, which is incredible.
Oh, that's great. No, I'm pleased, because that's the sort of response I would look to get and hope to get. Brafferton, again, the one up in North Yorkshire, roughly the same size as Barnum, slightly smaller. But look at what it received and dispatched. Now, do you remember, this is just railway wagons? This is just railway wagons it was moving out. It was moving probably, I would guess, 3 or 4 times as many lorries each day as that. I've got the figures somewhere. Again, if you want to see my research, you're very welcome. And the sheer quantity of stuff they handled, over that period. Now, if you look at the top, they only dropped 1 million tons of bombs, throughout the war. And I've said they handled 3 million tons. I'm not quite sure of the provenance of that figure, or where I got it from, but it's not made up by me. I got it from somewhere. When I compare and contrast the two, I think, not sure about that. It might be, I don't know, because this is just 42 Group RAF. And, I'm not sure. Maybe, but of course, not every bomb got dropped. There was still a huge amount of ammunition to be got rid of after the war. So maybe it's partly that. And that's another thing the railways did, of course. They had to move all this stuff back again for it to be destroyed. So that's another point.
Yeah, that's a very good point there. Yeah. Moving on, last concluding remarks.
This is my final slide, guys. You'll be pleased about this. And apologies for the size of the print. As I say, the field hasn't really been studied, except by me. I don't know why, but it is interesting. And going back to your first question, Paul, military history or railways, which one? Well, they both fit together. But how did they do it? How did they do it? And, I've used the word there, a successful campaign. Well, but, successful against what measure? The morality bit has to come in there again. I don't use that term, a successful campaign, lightly. I recognise the issues that surround it still. I've shown, I hope, that they improved their processes. But, how efficient were they? How economical were they, really? Has anybody crunched those numbers about what it cost, in terms of just gold? What did it cost us all? Oh, crikey, I did have a figure about what percentage of effort the RAF put in that I can't come to mind, forgive me. There's lots of bit still to look at, which I'd like to look at, and I'd encourage anybody else who's a historian out there to think about these bits at all. All these bits don't seem to have been thought about at all. Moving fuel pre the pipeline. How did they do that? They moved hundreds of thousands of people around the country, not just RAF people, Navy people, Army people, civilians, land girls, people working in munitions factories. They had to do all that. They moved the general stores. They moved the aircraft parts. I mentioned before, the major part they played in building airfields. And that's a serious point I made. They moved lots of rubble from the east end of London to form the hardcore for the US airfields.
But and another thing, just while you were talking there, is that we said it earlier on, is that all this is happening while the railways are also being used for civilians. I mean, think how what public outcry would have been if soldiers weren't getting back on leave, if they get a 48-hour pass and there's literally no trains running because it's all taking bombs to airfields. People would. You've got to the British government had to balance everything. They have to balance getting stuff to places to win the war, but getting returning servicemen back home when they've got leave, to get people from frontline to hospitals, all being used by this clearly stretched rail network. It's a fine balancing act. Just that Jeff came up with a possibility about the discrepancy in figures. Talking about there's the ammunition for machine guns, of course, being transported. So that would account for thousands of tons as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was generally 0.303 they carried. That's a very good point indeed. And it's possible, I guess, that some might have been for fighter commanders or bomber command and coastal command, as you said, but I don't know. But I've mentioned there, all the stuff he did for the RAF, and you mentioned as well civilians and the other services. There's all this stuff to do. And I think I've got to say right at the end that road transport was so significant. And if I argue the railways have been overlooked, then the road system just didn't exist. I could find so little about road transport in the war. I read one author who said that, an academic author, who said that everything eventually gets moved by road. I'm not quite sure that it's exactly correct, but I think it's good food for thought. And clearly, rail and road had to operate together. They were interdependent. You just couldn't operate one without the other. You've got the mass movement of ammunition by trains, and then the spreading out of it by road. And that's the way it seemed to work.
My granddad was involved in heavy anti-aircraft artillery in the UK, and he was often in charge in moving a battery from location A to location B. And he would talk at great length about how much that involved in terms of stationing various personnel along the road, because the last thing you want is 24 trucks or however many it was going off down the wrong way because they've taken a wrong turning, because there's no signs up, there's blackout, there's this, that, and the other, there's security there. And the fact they've only got enough fuel for the journey that's been allocated. So if they're traveling over a 30-mile distance, they've got fuel for that 30-mile distance plus a bit more, because there isn't spare fuel to allow for these trucks to bimble around housing estates, knocking on doors, saying, "Excuse me, can you tell me where this field is, please?"
Exactly.
So he would talk at great length about that, and that's the road network as well. And then you're multiplying this 1,000 times by all the units that are moving around the UK all the time, and we haven't even got into the fact of the language and the fact there's all these other nations arriving there with their ways of moving things, and it's a literal minefield. Well, it's not a literal minefield. It is a minefield, but it's amazing stuff. So brilliant.
Thanks, Paul. And that's it as far as I'm concerned, guys. I'm very happy to take any further questions if there's time for questions, Paul. But
we'll do a couple. Yeah, no, it's been absolutely fantastic, Gary. I've really enjoyed it. So you kind of touched on this, but Trent Tolenko, our resident Americans, just wants to confirm. I'm going to find it there. He is asking, did the RAF move bombers for the 8th Air Force?
Not as far as I'm aware. It was very much done by the 8th Air Force themselves, and the RAF did it for themselves as well.
I would assume the 8th Air Force has more trucks. I would assume there's more than the RAF. I mean, but we'll find out that.
But they actually requisitioned civilian trucks as well. If you read Roger Freeman, the 8th Air Force at War, is it? Or I can't remember the exact title, but he says in there very clearly that the US Army Air Force requisitioned civilian trucks in UK as well as using their own. I don't think it means requisitioned in the sense of taking them off the owners. I think it means more on a commercial basis. They hired them, which is what the RAF did. But I think that's what it means. But no, they didn't move stuff for the
A comment from Dan there. Dan is, of course, at the Bomber Command Digital Archive, was on the channel recently. He says, I used to work in warehousing, loading and unloading lorries all day, sometimes hardboarding stuff, sometimes with FLTs. This is an immense task they were doing. So Dan, who knows his Bomber Command stuff, I'm hoping this has given him some fuel for thought about another aspect there. That's something he could dig through some of the archives he's got. There may be something in his collection there about this aspect. I mean, as I always do for a show, I had a quick look through some of my books about bomb groups and what have you. And other than them saying they needed X number of bombers for certain operations, there was no real mention of where they came from. In fact, when they said they came from bomb dumps, that was it. There was just nothing in there, because it's a rabbit hole that I guess the author's talking about a bomber group's missions. How many rabbit holes do you go down of the backstory? But it's been fascinating tonight learning about this. I'll just see if there's any more questions. Dan is saying he has interviewed an armourer who lost a bomb off the back of a lorry and had to chase it down a hill. I wonder how many times that happened.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, you saw the way they were stored on that lorry, didn't you? I can imagine that happening, quite frankly.
And I'm assuming, with the fact that there were these 4 separate railway companies using a variety of stock from different eras, that there was no standard method for transporting a standard type of bomb. It was a case of fit the bomb to the wagons you've got available that day. I mean I
think that's exactly right. I mean it goes back to those 2 photos from Fold, the Stockton Tramway. Different ways of moving them. That wagon we saw, a different way again. I couldn't find a really, really good source was the minutes of the operating committee of the Railway Executive Committee. That was where I got most of my railway information from. And there was 1 or 2 bits in there about a very detailed technical description of storing bombs in a particular type of wagon, which I won't repeat here. But that was the only source I found to say, you will move this particular type of munition in this way. Everything else, they just seem to do, within bounds. They couldn't use grease axle boxes, no doors in the floor kind of thing. But generally,
Brilliant. Well, the Great Dominion is asking, is any use of canal barges for transporting ammo or fuel to airfields? Well, I don't know whether you know the answer to that, Gary, but it does raise the question of whether or not we do a canals and rivers week at some point in this channel. But
that
do you know of any canals being used?
I mean, the canals were important in wartime, weren't they? Particularly for transporting coal. That was the big thing I think they moved around. I'm positive they might have moved munitions, because they moved almost everything. But of course, they were very slow, weren't they? Yeah. They could carry big loads compared to road and rail, but they were very slow. And I've not seen anything about RAF ammunition being moved by barge, I'm sorry to say. But
we will leave it there. It's been a fantastic inaugural appearance on World War II TV. I look forward to you delving into something else and giving your analytical spin on things, because the data you provided is really fantastic. And I think we're all going away going, lots more to think about, which is the best type of show on World War II TV, rather than just rehashing the same old history that everyone's heard a million times before. Is going away with some thoughts. So thank you very much. You were nervous. Was it as bad as you thought it was going to be?
Nowhere near. Thanks, Paul. Nowhere near.
Brilliant.
But thank you for thinking of me. That's very kind.
Brilliant. So, folks, I will see you all again tomorrow night, back to the usual time with Dr. Philip Blood, who's talking about wars, railways, and films. So that'll be tomorrow. So thanks, everybody, for your attention. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Good night.